Hi, I'm Dawn Roller, Workforce Solutions Leader at Chamberlain University. I am also certified in many multiple generation certifications and trainings. And today we're going to have a conversation about working with generational strengths in the workplace. In this conversation, we're really living in an unprecedented time globally where we have multiple generations illuminating under all industries, all leadership, all walks of life. We will talk in a developing humans type of way and an approach. So our panel will have a generational discussion, and really it'll be keyed in on healthcare since we are Chamberlain, but also on education, collaboration, and the rest of the industries. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our brilliant panelists now. So Sharice Jessup, she is a strategic learning leader, and she is passionate, and the relationships that she builds are always filled with passion, tenacity. She's a DEI strategist. Sharice's experience has spanned many industries with a C-suite knowledge, and she also works with a multi-generational workforce. Next, we have Peggy Guillory. Peggy is a dedicated and creative healthcare development leader. With her team has multi-generations. She really coaches each individual to where they are, who they are, how they look at the world, and really has a 20-year track record for building deep relationships and establishing new approaches to really improve effectiveness across multiple generations. And the deep understanding that she has of the generations on her team and around her internally and externally really work into an amazing culture that anyone can learn from. And last but not least, we've got James Officer III. James has 25 years experience in coaching others to maximize their opportunities. James is an author, and currently he's a chief operating officer in the healthcare leadership space. And his experience as a speaker and trainer from high school audiences to traditional audiences really he's facilitated over 300 different seminars, and he was a speaker for the TEDx stage in May of 2017. So right now we'll move on to our questions. We've looked at our brilliance and our panelists, and James will join us shortly. So we're going to stick with the three of us to start, and then he will come on soon. So first of all, we're going to talk about different generations. Some people say there's 4, some people say there's 5, some people say there's more. So let's go ahead, and Peggy, we will start with you when it comes to the multi-generations, and just give us a generational view on how to look at it.
Sure. So, thank you. Currently I'm working in the healthcare space. So, just like James, and really it's interesting because within nursing, for instance, we, again, like you had mentioned, unprecedented times where we have 5 generations at the bedside right now. We have the baby boomers, the older baby boomers that normally would be retiring at this point, but they make up 50% of the current nursing workforce. The deferring retirement based on a lot of different reasons, mostly economics, but sometimes they just don't want to leave. Nope, we're back again.
There we go. Yes.
There we go. I don't know. Oh, sure. So, as I was saying, we have the 5 different generations at the bedside now, and instead of favoring one generation over the other, institutions can really benefit from celebrating these differences and promoting the strengths of each of the various generational cultures, and from them, it can work towards effective communication. I'm sure anybody who's worked with the myriad of cohorts knows that a baby boomer communicates very differently than a millennial. So learning how each other communicates and how they can hear each other, as well as like technology literacy. You have those millennials that are coming into the workforce that are being trained in school about all the new the records keeping and all the different ways that they're doing research now that they didn't have that in the educational that the baby boomers had. So there's so much to learn from each other that that's really what we need to focus on.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Peggy. Moving over to you, Sharice, when it comes to the other industries outside of healthcare, looking at 4 or at 5 or at 6, how do you look at generations?
So first off, I appreciate and am very excited about being part of this panel discussion. I am really enthralled with the fact that we do have, to echo Peggy's sentiments, we do have 5 generations in the workplace. So whether you are in healthcare, you're in IT, you are in retail, or in other industries, accounting, finance, legal, real estate, any of that, you're going to have 5 generations, and it's about the approach to each of those generations, whether you're in leadership or if you are a frontline individual. One of the things that I see that resonates across all of those generations is the fact that there is a transference of knowledge. You have the way that people approach how and when and what to do with the skills that they have. And the unique thing about it is the fact that those that are representing each of those generations, they recognize that there are certain attributes that contribute to the success of those projects or those responsibilities that they are supposed to fulfill. So I find that it's very fascinating seeing the way that even now, as we're talking about the cultural acumen and competency of how things are transcending across cultural understandings and experiences, it also affects the generations that are represented in each of those segments. So I myself believe that there are 5 generations in the workplace, and they are actively engaged in the workplace, whether they are working full-time or they're providing some type of advice or direction of that sort. So that's my perspective in that regard.
Absolutely. James, so we're talking about some people looking at 4, at 5, at 6 different generational types in the workplace right now. How do you look at that? Okay, I think we're having some technical difficulties. I've got James kind of frozen there. He's got an amazing view, so I'll go ahead and share the view that I know James has in this question, and then we'll move on to the next one. So, James, are you live with us again? Can you hear me? Okay. We'll go ahead and go, and then I'll come up to you on the next question. So when James looks at it, he actually says instead of 5 that there's 10 generations because he looks at the cusp. If you're at the beginning of, there we go. Can I hear you? Okay, you're still cutting out. We'll share this one and we'll fix our audio issues for the next question. But he looks at the beginning and the end. He's got a child that's at the beginning of a generation and one that's at the end.
Sharice's comment.
There we go. I hear you.
I don't hear anything now. So I have participated.
There we go. You're still cutting out on my end, James. We may want to, if you have a headset, that would be great. But looking at the generations, the point that he brought was that the generation, if you're at the beginning or the end, is totally different. So he's looking at those cusp angles. So if you're a Gen X or a Gen Y, whether you're at the beginning or the end of the generation really makes a huge difference. So let's go ahead and move on to the next question, and then we'll see if James' audio, if you have some headset, James, that'd probably work. So let's discuss kind of the generational challenge when it comes to solutions that you can see, because different generations look at things different ways. Conflict resolution, communication, teamwork, recognition, things like that. So what are the benefits of people looking at different subjects in many different ways? Peggy, we'll go over to you.
Well, I'm going to stick with healthcare, although it's not limited to just healthcare. The generational diversity in the clinical setting, the work groups there is really a gift, because each generation, I alluded to this earlier, that they bring such a strength that can assist in providing a culturally sensitive care to our multi-generation patient population. You think about a baby boomer nurse and a baby boomer patient, and how that nurse can help coach a millennial nurse to assist that patient and make them feel comfortable, which hopefully will help with patient outcomes, better patient outcomes.
Absolutely. And just having those same conversations to where everyone's opinion matters, everybody's thought matters.
Yep.
Sharice, we're going to go over to you. And how do you get everyone on the same similarities of different generations, or the similarities of how we all look at different things?
Oh, that's an ever evolving, I guess you could say, testament of how people are trying to do better as it relates to communication and engagement. What the first thing that I think of is I have in my own personal life, I have several generations in my family. And what happens is that in the conversation I had with one of my older siblings, she is a part of the boomer generation. And we were sitting down, we were talking about, you're transitioning out of one industry, one job function into another. And you've been in this particular role for several years, over a decade or two. And it's important to kind of transfer not only the knowledge for somebody coming up behind you, but also understanding what sort of industry you plan to transition to moving forward. And so we were sitting down and we were talking, and then my father, who happens to be he's in the traditionalist generation, he was listening in on the conversation. And the unique thing about it was that I was telling my sibling, I said, it's important to have a board of directors, and that board of directors encompasses every single one of those generations, because they each have a perspective and how you not only approach, how you communicate, how you engage, how you understand each other's likes, dislikes, things that are going to be important to the individual moving forward in their career, what sort of conversation topics are going to be most attractive and also resonate amongst those audiences that you're involving in. And it was kind of met with some resistance. And then yet my traditional father said, it's important for you to listen to what that is, what's being communicated and what's being shared, because that's going to help you. And he actually applied it to a biblical perspective as well, because he was like, well, look at the different examples that you see, and how, people thought a young person couldn't lead an army and they couldn't lead a country, and then yet they did, and they were the most revered leader. And then you have the adverse side of that. And so I think understanding and grasping the fact that there are in any industry that you pursue, consider adopting a board of directors, because they in turn will have that perspective to be able to share with you what's going to be most attractive, what's going to be most approachable, how to communicate, how to identify strengths, how to collaborate, and being able to implement those strategies that are responsible for your team or yourself or even your organization.
Wonderful. James, did we get back on audio? I think we're still frozen down there. Okay, let's move over to framing references. And when it comes to different things, and you mentioned about a younger person leading, an army or a generation and when you see different words like Cold War, civil rights, 9/11, World War II, Popeye, Space Jam, medical charts, there's different generations that work with those, and there's different generations that have no idea what you're talking about. So when it comes to your experience with the different generations and a workplace that transcends all eras, how do you make that an incredible culture when people look at those things all differently, or may not even know one of the decades? There we go. James, can you hear me?
Wow.
There we go. I heard wow. Can you hear me? Okay, I think he's still frozen, like you said. Okay, so Peggy, we're going to move over to you, and hopefully we get James by the end of the call. We'll see. How do you strengthen a team? Yeah, when you have so many eras and so many generations, how do you incorporate that to make a good culture or a good environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it really begins with how do you build that gap As you pointed out, there's personal experiences, whether it's social or their own, like their parents' experiences and their grandparents' experiences shared through storytelling. We all have those stories where our past generations in our families have shared what they experienced, not just what you learned in the history books, but what they actually saw with their own eyes, and that does influence us. You kind of think of those formative experiences as a foundation, and then the aspirations are as a subculture and communication preferences, because like I said, all the different generations have different preferences on how they communicate. That's kind of the superstructure. So education is really where you begin to dig deep and better develop a plan of action to building that bridge, and beginning with understanding what the background of each of the generations are, what types of events and upbringings does each group tend to share, how do these events impact each generation. Knowing these things really help you understand each of the generations in the workforce. Understanding how do they approach authority and hierarchy, how do they interact with leaders, what is their comfort level with new technologies. I had mentioned that earlier with the nursing baby boomers. What is the bias and assumptions that they tend to carry with them? Those are all things you need to understand as a leader in order to make sure that gap is bridged, and that we can all learn from each other and create a more diverse culture within the organization.
Exactly, because some of those time references actually build certain things, certain foundations and industries that we build upon. So like if you're in the governmental industry and you're not aware of some of these things, you may be left out to some knowledge and just some depth and breadth that other people have. Absolutely. So when it comes to the work day by day, Sharice, when you see everything, and I love the advice that you said your father gave and the difference of opinion on how you could use it, but how does that transcend to a workplace, or how can that be worked with the work day to day? How will that work?
I think that the way that could be implemented is creating, I know organizations have this strategy of creating mentor-mentee relationships from different segments within the organization to help with retention. I think that it goes beyond that. So in putting on, I guess you could say, my DEI hat, thinking through the different affinity representations of groups that are within an organization. You have those generations that also represent each of those groups, but you also have a difference of perspectives, and you have a difference of cultural competencies that have an opportunity to be transferred and translated amongst those that are willing to adopt those types of understanding. So I think it's a couple of things. The first thing is you have to be willing and open to sit down and to have the conversations and the dialogue and able to listen to what would be the advice of someone who has essentially experienced the thing that you have not yet experienced. And then two is, are you willing to implement even a portion of the strategy? Let's just face it, not everybody likes to take advice, and not everybody likes to implement that advice.
There's nobody on this call. Nobody on this call.
No, nobody. But I think it's just about how do you formulate a collaborative workspace that will adopt some of the perspectives to help an individual be successful. And so understanding that just because, me being a Gen Xer talking with a Gen Zer doesn't necessarily mean that I don't know everything, but I do know that I've experienced something that the Gen Zer may not have yet approached in that space in their life and in their time and in their career. That may be something that they can adopt. And the same thing with a person who's from a traditional or a boomer generation. There are some things that they've experienced prior to me that I can see that would be applicable in my work setting, in whether I'm being organized, leading a meeting, or how to approach conflict. And so I think a lot of that has to do with, are you willing to have a listening ear and also be able to implement some of the suggestions or even ideas that would be able to help you in where you're trying to go and trying to achieve.
Wonderful. And it's so important in the day-to-day. The similarities you just pointed out, or putting 2 or 3 people together to work together. It's actually really, really important. So let's talk about improving work quality. So some of the similarities of different generations can really improve our work quality or improve the collaboration or the mastermind team that's putting that work together. So how can you leverage multiple generations to improve work quality and quantity? Let's move back to Sharice and then we'll go over to Peggy.
Well, I think improving quality is understanding exactly what's the driving factor. Each generation is going to have a different driving factor, different from the other. But if there is a common theme in which that factor involves, then there is opportunity for progression. If we're talking about even in today's events, and we've got a lot of things going on as we talk about racial inequality and reform in law enforcement, you see all of the different generations that are represented in each industry because it is a cross-cultural area of opportunity for us all to evolve and to grow from, and then to provide a solution. So if you find and identify what is the overall foundational theme, then what's the strategy for a solution in order to be able to, again, move forward, resolve the problem, identify what that problem is, and also the gap. What is the gap? And what are the resources that you need? So like Peggy had talked about how technology tends to be, it's almost like, it's a new experience and people can approach it fearfully or they can embrace it. I like technology when it's working. But yet, what sort of tools are you going to use? What's the underlying strategy and foundation? And then how best can you be able to identify what those solutions are moving forward? And that is what I feel would help with bridging that gap and filling the void for those that are in that space.
Absolutely. James, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
We can. Yay.
Wow.
So you just demonstrated our technology, part of our generations portion. When it comes to similarities in different generations, and we're really talking about the work quality and quantity. So if you can kind of catch us up on how you look at generations and kind of how you look at the similarities in the work, that would be phenomenal. And then we'll move over to Peggy.
Yeah, well, one similarity would be all the generations have issues with Wi-Fi and and bad weather that creates difficulty when we're trying to connect virtually. So we can all relate to that. But I think also that there is a genuine desire in every generation, whether I'm talking to my grandparents are deceased now, but when they were here, whether I was talking to my grandparents or talking to my children, there is a genuine desire to succeed, whatever that looks like. And it looks different for every generation, what success means, right? So for my grandfather, it was to simply take care of his family and provide a good living. For my children, it's to have impact, whether they ever make money doing it at all. And I'll give you an example. My youngest daughter, I know she wouldn't mind me sharing it, is a trained engineer. Went to Spelman, earned a math degree in 3 years, and then finished the engineering degree in 2 more years. So brilliant young lady. And out of college was working, making a 6-figure income at 24 years old, and decided she wanted to teach. And so now she's teaching mathematics in high school at half of that and as happy as she can be. That is certainly generational. It gave daddy a heart attack, but for her, it absolutely made sense. So my point is, it may look different, but for her, that is success. And I think if we can recognize that while we may use the same terms in different generations, they mean different things. And so I think it becomes incumbent upon, and again, no pressure, but I think it becomes incumbent upon the older generations, in this case, the traditionalists, the baby boomers, and now even Generation X, becomes incumbent upon us to understand what that interpretation is so that we can bring value to those younger generations in the workplace.
Oh, Don, I think you're muted.
There we go. I shared your view on the different generations, James, when it came to the cusp. Can you explain that real quick, and then we'll move over to the similarities with Peggy?
Yeah, again, and so much of the learning and I think it happens for all of us, so much of my learning comes from my own family. And so I have children who are a Generation Z, and then a child that's a cusper between Z and millennial, and then two that are clear millennial. And I noticed that there are different thought patterns, even between my clear Generation Z child and the two that are millennial or Generation Y. So perception, even of current events, different. Perception of work and value for work, it's different. Not bad, not good, just different. So from that, I determined that, wow, all this time we've been sort of ignoring this cusp group or lumping them in with one or the other, when in fact, because of where they're born, they have these clear and definite influences from both generations. So I've started to count them as a generation unto themselves. And so that's why I say we have 10 generations. And again, I don't have the academic background to support that, but I will argue that just based on my own experience.
Hey, argument is plenty. So let's look at the similarities when it comes to the generations, and what are some of those characteristics, Peggy, just kind of leveraging multiple generations in the healthcare space?
Sure. So, I mean, I think that as James pointed out, there's this overlap, this where they're cuspers, and that brings in the similarities. But I think across all the generations, just the basic characteristics of wanting to pass on to the next generation what they've learned is one of the one that I would probably point out the most.
Definitely. And like you said, education is such an important part of that. So when it comes to the day-to-day, just to make sure that that education transpons every day. So yep. I saw a quote the other day by Gloria Steinem, and it said, we need to remember across generations that there is as much to learn as there is to teach. And as Peggy said, it's very, very important when it comes to generational, teaching the gaps, teaching the history, teaching the culture, and just working with everyone's strengths, because one strength that one generation has, it may not, like James said, be in another generation. The heart attack moment for him, his daughter was like, this is perfectly how to design my success. If you talk to our parents or our grandparents, it might look totally different than what our children look like or we look at. So let's go ahead and go around to the panelists one last time for kind of some final inspiration and thoughts on working through generational strengths in the workplace. So Sharice, your final thoughts?
My final thoughts is that we have not yet arrived in terms of learning and knowing everything. And as what has been discussed today is, and what resonates with me is that you have to be open to hearing the perspectives of multiple generations to be able to formulate your own pathway and determine what sort of journey you want to take next, and how you can take a little bit of that with you along the way, because those are life lessons. Those are gems that you don't gather them up now, trying to gather them up when you think that you've gone to your final destination. You'll be looking back wishing that you had. So I think being open to embrace and understand the different perspectives of those generations and seeing how I can grow from them is what I've taken away from this discussion today.
I think hindsight is always 20/20. I think
like
back
2019.
Yeah, my husband and I are the oldest we're the oldest generation in our family right now, and I wish I would have learned so much from those generations before us that I took for granted until it was no longer a possibility. So that's when you think about it that way, and you're like, I could have learned so much, and you just try to teach the younger generations that, but sometimes it's a lesson you don't learn until you're in that position where there is no more and you can't go back and learn. So Peggy, moving over to you when it comes to your last final inspirational thoughts.
Yeah, I want to echo what Sharice says. I love how you articulated that. And I'm a true believer of listening, learning, and educating. and taking the time to understand the strengths and the challenges of each generation. I think that's just as important, to understand where they came from. And to James's point, the sub generations, the cuspers, bringing that into the workplace as a strength in your organization, and helps you meet your customers' needs or your patients' needs, whatever field you're looking at in the moment. But it's, really they're mirroring who you're working for, whether it's a customer, a patient, organization, a passion, whatever it is. So I think that listening, learning, and educating is what we really need to focus on.
I absolutely agree. I think that's important at all times. And, when we were talking about this panel, James, we talked about, and Peggy and Sharice, we talked about the times that we're in right now. So, James, if you could kind of share your generational thoughts and kind of just our current state thoughts for your final inspiration.
Yeah, thank you for asking that and framing it that way. Because 2 weeks ago, literally 14 days ago, I would have answered that question differently. But what I've witnessed over the last 14 days isn't new. It isn't new that we have racial upheaval, and we've got protests and people who are fed up. And frankly, I'm among those. However, the way I view it now is that when in framing it in the conversation about generations, is that all of a sudden we see where our commonality usurps our differences. So in the midst of a worldwide pandemic, one day people can't talk, can't see each other, can't touch each other. The next day, all over the nation, they are in the middle of the street, elbow to elbow, screaming and chanting. What happened? Isn't there still a nationwide, worldwide pandemic? Yes, there is. But something was touched, and that is the humanity in each person. Dr. Covey says it this way, that the highest need of the human soul is to be validated, valued, and appreciated. And when we can connect on those 3 points, generationally, racially, across gender, across religion, every single person desires at the highest level, that in Maslow's hierarchy, at that self-actualization level, everyone desires to be valued, validated, and appreciated. And when we can do that, as we've watched it happen across the country, if we can value individual differences, appreciate things that are different from us, and show true concern for individuals, not judging their opinions, not judging their thoughts, but showing real value for it, then race relations becomes something magical. And I'm not just talking about race as in color of skin, but I'm talking about that ultimate race, and that's the human race. And if we can appeal to the humanity in each person, and each one of us focuses on healing ourselves, then we will live in a healed society. And I'll say it this way, and I'll shut up. That it's been said that hurt people, and everyone's heard that before. And the way my brain works, if we accept that, then you also have to accept that healed people heal people. And so if we could focus on individual healing, then we could really look at bridging these gaps that will be bridged once and for all.
I agree.
Well said.
I agree. And I love when you said, and I will shut up, because it's like, no, we've taken this call trying to get to hear your voice. But I think if we leave you with one thing in this panel, it just starts the conversation. It's that humanistic element. I would like to personally thank anyone that tuned in, that started this conversation, because anytime you deal with generations, or anytime you work with generations, look for the brilliance in each human. Because if you cannot bridge the gap with the different age differential, you can bridge that gap with brilliance. You can pick out each little piece of brilliance and put them together in a cohesive, as James said, humanistic element. And sometimes we forget that. We get so focused on the company, the industry, the job, that we forget each of us are human, and each one, like he said, we want to be validated, we want to be heard, we want to be loved at the end of the day. And our professional fiber, does a lot of that. So I just thank you, Sharice and Peggy and James, for having this conversation with me. It's brought to you by Chamberlain. So from the College of Health Professionals, the College of Nursing, we appreciate you all working together on that humanistic element. So this will conclude our panel today. We appreciate everyone for being here, and our panelists, thank you for the brilliance you put out there in the world through generations. That's a wrap.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.